My friend, one of the greatest desires in the heart of every believer is to know God's will. Deep down, we all want to understand what He's doing, where He's leading, and how we can walk in His purpose. But sometimes the path isn't clear. Sometimes we find ourselves waiting, wondering, and asking, Lord, what do you want me to do? God's will is revealed through relationship, not just revelation. Too many people spend their lives chasing signs, searching for supernatural confirmation, or waiting for a dramatic moment when God suddenly drops His plan into their lap. They want a voice from heaven, a burning bush, a lightning bolt of direction. But God's way is often quieter, simpler, and far more personal. He reveals His will not primarily through extraordinary events, but through the ordinary intimacy of a daily walk with Him. When we truly seek God's will, we must first seek God Himself. The will of God is not a secret map. It's a living relationship with the one who holds the map. If you pursue the path without knowing the guide, you'll always end up confused. But if you pursue the guide, the path will always become clear in time. God desires relationship more than results. His will flows naturally out of communion with Him. The closer you walk with Him, the more naturally you begin to sense His direction, because His desires begin to shape your desires. When you read the Scriptures, you can see this pattern over and over. God didn't just hand out instructions like a checklist. He called people into fellowship first, then revealed direction as they walked with Him. Abraham didn't know where he was going. He simply trusted the voice of God and went where he was led. Moses didn't receive all of God's plans for Israel on day one. He learned step by step as he spent time in God's presence, talking to Him as a friend. David didn't become a man after God's own heart because he was perfect, but because he valued the presence of God above everything else. And when the time came for decisions, that relationship guided him more than any visible sign ever could. Revelation without relationship can be dangerous. It can make us prideful, independent, or impatient. It can lead to misinterpretation because we hear what we want to hear rather than what God is truly saying. That's why God doesn't just give us information, He gives us Himself. The purpose of His guidance is not merely to direct our actions, but to draw our hearts closer to Him. Knowing His will is the byproduct of knowing His character. When you know His nature, you begin to recognize His voice in every situation. You don't need constant outward proof when you have inward peace that comes from His presence. Spending time in prayer, meditating on His Word, and listening for His Spirit are not religious duties. They are the means by which our hearts align with His. As we spend time with Him, we begin to think differently, see differently, and act differently. The confusion that once clouded our minds starts to fade. Not because God suddenly speaks louder, but because our hearts have become quieter. We become more sensitive to the gentle whisper of His guidance. Sometimes that whisper comes as a thought that won't leave you alone, a burden you can't ignore, or a peace that confirms your next step. Other times it comes through the wisdom of Scripture, the advice of godly counsel, or even closed doors that redirect your path. But in all these ways, the source is the same, the relationship between you and your Heavenly Father. People often say, I wish I knew what God wanted me to do. But the real question is, do you know God well enough to recognize His voice when He speaks? If your relationship with Him is distant, even when He speaks clearly, you might miss it. Just as you recognize the voice of someone you love, even in a crowd, you recognize God's voice more easily when you've spent time with Him. The closer you walk with Him, the less you'll need constant signs or external confirmations. You'll simply know in your spirit because you know the one who leads you. God's will isn't just about where you go or what you do, it's about who you are becoming. His goal is to shape your heart into one that reflects His love, His patience, and His trust. Sometimes the waiting and uncertainty you face are part of that shaping process. When you focus only on revelation, on knowing the next step, you can miss what God is doing in the moment. But when you focus on relationship, you realize that every season, even the silent ones, has purpose. God uses the stillness to teach you dependence, the uncertainty to teach you faith, and the delay to deepen your intimacy with Him. Many people want God's direction without God's presence. They want His plan, but not the process of walking with Him daily. But the truth is, you cannot separate the two. You cannot have the will of God without the heart of God. The reason He sometimes withholds details is that He wants to draw you closer, to teach you to trust Him more than your circumstances. He reveals Himself progressively because spiritual maturity develops progressively. He is far more interested in your relationship than in your itinerary. When you live from relationship, guidance becomes natural. Decisions that once terrified, you begin to feel peaceful. Instead of begging for a sign, you rest in His timing. Instead of forcing outcomes, you allow Him to unfold things His way. You realize that obedience to His will isn't a burden, it's a blessing that flows out of love. You don't follow Him out of fear of missing something. You follow because you love Him and you trust that His plan is good. The beauty of this truth is that God never hides His will to confuse you. He hides it to call you closer. Every unanswered prayer, every unclear season, every detour is an invitation to draw near. He is saying, come sit with me of love, revealed step by step through a living relationship with the one who knows you best. God's will is not just a destination, it's the journey of walking with Him daily. Every prayer, every act of trust, every moment spent in His Word brings you deeper into alignment with His purpose. You don't have to strive to find His will. You simply have to stay close enough to hear His voice. And when you do, you'll realize that knowing Him is the greatest revelation of all. Obedience unlocks clarity. Many people spend years praying for direction, asking God to show them the next step, the next move, the next opportunity. They cry out for answers and plead for understanding. Yet often the silence they hear is not God withholding His will, but God waiting for their obedience. Clarity does not come before obedience, it follows it. When you take the step God has already shown you, even if it seems small or uncertain, the path begins to open one step at a time. The truth is, God rarely gives us the full picture in advance. He shows us just enough to take the next faithful step. That is how faith is built. If you could see the entire plan, you wouldn't need to trust Him. Obedience is the act of saying, Lord, I don't have to understand everything. I just need to trust You enough to do the last thing You told me. When you walk in obedience, even when it feels uncomfortable or unclear, you invite the light of God's wisdom into your situation. Each act of obedience adds another layer of understanding. The Bible is full of examples that reveal this truth. When Abraham obeyed God and left his home to go to a land he did not know, clarity came as he walked. When Moses obeyed God's call to lead Israel out of Egypt, the Red Sea didn't part until he stepped forward in faith. When Peter obeyed Jesus' instruction to cast his net on the other side of the boat, the miracle came only after the action. The same principle applies to us today. Obedience always precedes revelation. You can't wait for perfect understanding. Before moving, you gain understanding as you move. Many times we say we're waiting on God, but in reality, God is waiting on us. He's already given us a word, a command, or a direction, and we're hesitating, analyzing, or doubting. We want to know how everything will turn out before we commit, but faith doesn't work that way. God doesn't owe us explanations. He invites us into trust. When we delay obedience, we delay our blessing and prolong our confusion. But when we respond quickly, even when it doesn't make sense, clarity begins to emerge like the dawn breaking through darkness. Obedience isn't always glamorous. Sometimes it means forgiving someone who hurt you deeply, even when you'd rather hold on to resentment. Sometimes it means staying faithful in a quiet season when no one is watching. Other times it means taking a bold step of faith into the unknown. Every act of obedience tests your trust in God. Will you follow Him even when it costs you comfort, reputation, or cert? Ain't He? Because the truth is, obedience often requires sacrifice. You may have to give up something that feels safe or familiar, but what you gain is far greater the peace of walking in alignment with God's purpose. Clarity without obedience can be dangerous. If God revealed everything at once, we might run ahead of Him, try to control the outcome, or take credit for what He alone can do. Obedience teaches humility. It keeps us dependent on God rather than on our understanding. Each step of obedience reminds us that this journey isn't about our wisdom or strength. It's about trusting the one who knows the end from the beginning. As we obey, we learn to recognize His voice more clearly. The fog lifts and our hearts become sensitive to His leading. Sometimes obedience is the very thing that turns confusion into confirmation. There are moments when you pray for God to change your situation, but Hess actually using the situation to change you. You might be asking for direction when Hess asking for surrender. Once you obey what Hess already said, forgive, trust, serve, give, pray, wait, suddenly what seemed blurry begins to make sense. The obedience that felt small becomes the key that unlocks a door you couldn't see before. Think of it this way, God's guidance is often progressive. He gives light for one step, and when you take it, He gives light for the next. It's like walking with a lamp in the dark. You don't need to see the whole road, just enough to keep moving forward. But if you refuse to take the first step, the light won't move. The more you obey, the more clearly you see. The more you resist, the darker it becomes. Obedience isn't about earning God's favor. It's about positioning yourself to receive His direction. One of the greatest challenges in life is obeying when obedience doesn't make sense. When God tells you to bless someone who mistreated you, to give when your resources are low, or to move when everything in you wants to stay, it can feel unreasonable. But that's where faith grows strongest. God's instructions may not always make sense in the moment, but they always lead to something greater than you can imagine. Every time you obey in faith, you're declaring that you trust His wisdom more than your own. Clarity is the reward of consistent obedience. Over time, you begin to see how God was connecting the dots all along. The job you didn't get, the door that closed, the detour you didn't understand, all of it fits together in His perfect plan. But you only see that after you've walked the path of obedience. God never wastes a step taken in faith. Even when the path is rough or lonely, every act of obedience draws you closer to the clarity you seek. Obedience also deepens intimacy. When you obey God, you experience His faithfulness firsthand. You begin to recognize His provision, His timing, and His protection in ways you couldn't before. The more you obey, the stronger your relationship grows. And as that relationship deepens, clarity becomes a natural part of your spiritual walk. You no longer have to beg for direction. You simply live in tune with His Spirit. It's easy to talk about obedience in theory, but it's in the small everyday choices that it truly matters. Reading the Word when you feel tired, praying when you don't see results, choosing integrity when compromise would be easier. These are the moments that shape your spiritual vision. Each act of faithfulness, no matter how ordinary, builds a foundation of clarity. Over time, obedience becomes a lifestyle, not a reaction. You begin to live with open hands, trusting that whatever God asks, He will also sustain. The miracle you're waiting for, the answer you've been praying for, may be on the other side of simple obedience. God often tests your faith in small ways before trusting you with greater assignments. When you obey what you already know to be right, He reveals what you don't yet understand. Obedience is not about understanding first, it's about trusting first. And when you trust first, understanding follows. So when you find yourself uncertain, take inventory of your obedience. Go back to the last thing God told you to do and ask yourself if you've done it. Don't wait for all the answers before moving forward. Step out in faith and the answers will come. Every time you obey, you move from confusion to confidence, from hesitation to hope. The path becomes brighter, your spirit becomes stronger, and your faith becomes unshakable. Obedience opens the door to clarity, and clarity opens the way to peace. Divine change requires patience and trust because God's transformation never happens overnight. The way He works in a person's life is not through sudden ease, but through steady growth. His timing is perfect, even when it feels delayed. Often we want immediate answers, instant breakthroughs, and quick relief, but God's purpose is deeper than convenience. He is not just changing circumstances, He is shaping character, and that shaping takes time. When we learn to trust His process, we begin to see that every waiting season has meaning, and every delay carries divine intention. What feels like a pause is often preparation for what's ahead. Patience is one of the hardest lessons to learn because it goes against human nature. We live in a world that values speed, that God values depth. We want progress we can see, yet He's working on. In the beginning, it feels like nothing is happening, but over time, you realize that God is changing you even when He hasn't changed your situation. He's teaching endurance, humility, and dependence on Him. The person who emerges from the waiting season is not the same one who entered it. You become stronger, wiser, and more sensitive to God's voice. The waiting refines your faith, burns away impatience, and purifies motives. What once felt like delay becomes divine development. God's change also requires patience because He often works through process, not miracles. There are moments when He moves suddenly, but most of the time He works gradually. He's not only interested in the result, but in what you learn along the way. Each step of obedience builds the next one. Each season of waiting adds another layer of strength. When you learn to trust the process, you stop resisting it. You stop asking, when will this end? And start asking, what are you teaching me here? That mindset transforms frustration into faith. Sometimes patience means continuing to do what's right even when you see no reward. It means praying when you don't feel like it, forgiving when it's hard, and believing when everything looks impossible. Trust keeps you steady during those moments. It reminds you that obedience always leads to blessing, even if the results aren't immediate. God honors faithfulness. He's never late. He's always on time. His time, not ours. And His timing is designed not to punish, but to perfect. There's beauty in how God works slowly. Just as a tree doesn't grow overnight, neither does spiritual maturity. Every root takes time to deepen before fruit appears. The longer the process, the stronger the foundation. If you've been praying and waiting, don't lose heart. God hasn't forgotten you. He's preparing something that requires time, a kind of blessing that can't be rushed. What He builds in patience lasts far longer than anything achieved in haste. Trusting God also means letting go of fear. Fear whispers that God won't come through, that time is running out, that maybe you've been forgotten. But trust silences fear with faith. It says, even if I can't see it, I know God is working. When you trust, you rest. You stop striving to make everything happen and instead find peace in knowing that God already has a plan. That peace is a sign of spiritual maturity, the calm assurance that divine timing is never wrong. Sometimes the greatest proof of faith is not in movement, but in stillness. It's in standing firm when everything tells you to quit. Patience is strength in disguise. It's the quiet confidence that God's promises are worth waiting for. You may not see the outcome yet, but your obedience today is building it. God is never in a hurry, but He's never late either. His timing carries purpose, and His delays are not denials. In every season of waiting, God is both working and watching. He watches how you respond, how you trust, and how you grow. Each test of patience is also a chance to show faith. When you trust God in the delay, you're proving that your faith isn't dependent on circumstances. It's rooted in who He is. And when the time is right, when your heart is ready and your faith refined, the change you've been waiting for will come suddenly, beautifully, and powerfully. Divine change requires patience and trust because God's transformation is about eternal growth, not instant gratification. He is preparing you for something greater than you can imagine, and every moment of waiting is part of that preparation. When you stop resisting the process and start trusting His purpose, peace fills the waiting. What once felt like delay becomes destiny unfolding. In time, you'll look back and realize that the waiting wasn't wasted. It was the very season where God did His greatest work in you. God's transformation leads to freedom and peace, because when He changes a person from within, He removes the burdens that have long kept them captive. Every human heart carries something heavy: guilt from the past, fear of the future, pain from disappointment, or the pressure to control what cannot be controlled. These weights are what rob us of peace. We try to manage them on our own, hoping that success, relationships, or distractions will make them lighter, but they never do. True peace does not come from changing life circumstances. It comes from allowing God to change the heart. When His Spirit begins to work within you, chains begin to fall and the soul finally finds rest. Freedom is not just the absence of struggle. It is the presence of God's peace. His transformation breaks the invisible chains that tie us to worry, anger, and regret. It doesn't mean that life becomes easy or problems disappear. but it means you are no longer ruled by them. You begin to experience the kind of freedom that cannot be taken away by circumstances. When God renews your heart, He replaces fear with faith, confusion with clarity, and chaos with calm. You start living not under the weight of what was, but under the grace of what is being made new. When God changes you, He sets you free from your past. The mistakes you once carried, the shame that used to haunt you, and the guilt that stole your joy lose their power. His forgiveness is not partial, it is complete. It doesn't just cover your sins, it erases them from the record. That's why His transformation feels like a deep breath after years of suffocation. You realize you no longer have to prove your worth, earn His love, or hide your failures. He already knows it all, and He chooses to love you anyway. That kind of unconditional grace creates the foundation for lasting peace. God's transformation also brings freedom from fear. Fear thrives where faith is absent. It whispers lies that keep you anxious about what could go wrong, about whether you'll have enough or whether you'll make it through. But when God transforms your heart, He replaces fear with trust. You begin to see life not as something to survive, but as something to walk through with Him by your side. Fear loses its voice when faith speaks louder. Peace becomes your response, not because everything is perfect, but because you know who holds everything in His hands. There's also freedom from bitterness and resentment. Many people live trapped by what others have done to them. They carry unforgiveness like a chain around their heart. But God's transformation softens those hard places. He teaches you that forgiveness is not about excusing the wrong, but about releasing yourself from its hold. When you forgive, you set yourself free. The anger that once consumed you loses its grip, and peace begins to take root. That's how God restores relationships, not always by changing others, but by changing the way you see them. His transformation heals the heart so that love can flow where pain once lived. Peace also comes when God transforms your perspective. Before, you may have lived reacting to everything around you, people's opinions, circumstances, or disappointments. But when He renews your mind, you stop being controlled by external things. You no longer need validation from the world to feel secure. Your peace is anchored in something unshakable, the truth of God's presence. Even when life shifts, you remain steady because your peace doesn't depend on what changes, it depends on who never changes. This transformation is not sudden. It unfolds through a process of surrender. The more you yield your will to God, the freer you become. Each time you choose to trust instead of worry, to forgive instead of resent, to obey instead of resist, another chain breaks. Slowly, the old version of you fades away, the anxious, fearful, striving self, and a new person emerges, one who walks in peace even amid pressure. That is the miracle of divine transformation. It doesn't remove the storm, but it teaches you how to rest in the middle of it. God's transformation also brings freedom from self-dependence. Many people live under the weight of trying to control outcomes, plan every detail, and fix every problem. This creates constant stress because life rarely goes as planned. But when you allow God to transform you, you learn the peace of surrender. You begin to trust His plan more than your own. You no longer need to understand everything to have peace. You simply need to know that He does. That's real freedom, to live without the pressure of controlling what only God can handle. Another aspect of this transformation is the renewal of identity. God sets you free from false labels, the names life or others have given you: failure, not enough, broken, forgotten. He calls you beloved, redeemed, and chosen. When you begin to see yourself the way He does, you stop living like a victim and start walking like someone who is victorious. Peace fills your heart because your value no longer depends on performance, but on His love. This inner freedom allows you to face life's challenges without losing your sense of worth or direction. Even in moments of pain, God's transformation continues to work. There is peace that can exist even in sorrow. Not the peace that denies pain, but the peace that sustains you through it. You learn to rest in the truth that God can bring beauty out of ashes, purpose out of pain, and strength out of weakness. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin saying, "What is God doing through me?" That shift of perspective is the essence of spiritual freedom. You are no longer controlled by what happens. You are guided by the one who holds every outcome. As God continues His work in you, peace becomes your natural state, not just a fleeting emotion. It becomes the quiet confidence that no matter what happens, you are secure in His hands. You stop chasing temporary relief and start enjoying lasting contentment. The heart that was once restless becomes still. The mind that was once filled with anxiety becomes calm. That is what divine transformation does. It brings freedom from everything that once controlled you and peace that cannot be shaken by the storms of life. When God transforms you, you experience the kind of freedom that no circumstance, person, or fear can take away. You walk through life lighter, with a heart that trusts and a soul that rests. Peace is not something you try to hold on to. It becomes who you are because His Spirit lives within you. The transformation God brings is not about changing your surroundings. It's about changing your spirit so deeply that you are free no matter where you are and peaceful no matter what you face. That is the miracle of His work. A life set free and a heart completely at peace.